In 1405, China launched the largest naval expedition in human history. Not large by ancient standards, not large compared to other pre-modern fleets, large by any standard, including modern ones. The flagship, the treasure ship, or Baochuan, was approximately 400 feet long and 160 feet wide. To put that in perspective, Christopher Columbus's Santa María, the ship that reached the Americas in 1492, was around 85 feet long. The treasure ship was nearly 5 times longer. It displaced more water than a modern destroyer. It had 9 masts. Nothing like it had ever sailed any ocean before, and nothing like it would sail again for centuries. And there wasn't just one of them. The first expedition included 62 treasure ships and over 250 support vessels, tankers carrying fresh water, warships for protection, transports carrying horses, supply ships, and floating dry docks capable of repairing the fleet at sea. 27,000 men. An entire floating city. This fleet sailed to Southeast Asia, Ceylon, India, Arabia, and the east coast of Africa. It did so 7 times over 28 years. Then, in 1525, the Chinese government ordered the destruction of every ocean-going vessel in the country. Ships that couldn't be burned were left to rot. The shipyards were dismantled. The navigational charts were confiscated. The records of 7 voyages across the known world were systematically erased. 67 years after China burned its fleet, Columbus crossed the Atlantic in a ship 1/5 the size of what China had been building a century earlier. The question that should stop you is not what China discovered. It's what happened inside China that made it choose to undiscover the world. To understand why the fleet was destroyed, you first need to understand who built it and why. Zheng was not a typical Chinese official. He was born in 1371 in the southwestern province of Yunnan to a Muslim family. His father and grandfather had both made the pilgrimage to Mecca, and he grew up speaking Arabic alongside Chinese. When the Ming Dynasty conquered Yunnan, Zheng was captured as a boy of about 11, castrated, and sent to serve in the imperial household as a eunuch. In the brutal logic of the Ming court, this made him trustworthy in a very specific way. A eunuch could never father children. He could never establish a competing dynasty. He could never become a threat in the way that a powerful general with sons and ambitions might become a threat. The most sensitive positions in the empire, managing the emperor's household, commanding certain military operations, undertaking diplomatic missions, were assigned to eunuchs precisely because their biology made them structurally loyal. Zheng was exceptionally gifted even among eunuchs. He rose through the ranks of the imperial household to become one of the closest confidants of the Yongle emperor, a man who had seized the throne from his own nephew in a brutal civil war and was acutely sensitive to questions of legitimacy. The Yongle emperor needed the voyages for reasons that had nothing to do with exploration and everything to do with politics. He had stolen the throne. The previous emperor, his nephew, the Jianwen emperor, had disappeared during the conquest of Nanjing under circumstances that were never fully explained. Rumors persisted that he had survived and was living in exile, waiting to reclaim his throne. The Yongle emperor needed 2 things: to demonstrate that the mandate of heaven had genuinely passed to him, and to find out whether his nephew was still alive. The voyages served both purposes. Every foreign king who sent tribute to Beijing was implicitly acknowledging the Yongle emperor as the legitimate ruler of China. Every giraffe, every ambassador, every exotic animal that arrived at court was evidence that heaven approved of the current emperor. And Zheng He's ships, carrying officials with instructions to investigate rumors of a surviving former emperor, were also, quietly, a search operation across the known world. The scale of what Zheng He accomplished is difficult to absorb even with the benefit of historical hindsight. The first voyage in 1405 reached Java and Sumatra, then crossed the Indian Ocean to Ceylon and the Malabar coast of India. The third voyage, in 1409, reached Hormuz, the entrance to the Persian Gulf, a trading hub that connected China to the entire Arab world. By the fourth voyage, the fleet was sailing down the east coast of Africa, reaching ports as far south as what is now Kenya and Tanzania.
At each stop, Zheng He did something that no European explorer of the same era was capable of. He arrived with overwhelming naval superiority and chose, mostly, to use it for diplomacy rather than conquest. Chinese goods, silk, porcelain, tea, were exchanged for local products. Foreign rulers received gifts. Ambassadors were invited to return to China with the fleet. Those who had conflicts with Chinese interests were dealt with firmly. Zheng He fought and won several naval engagements during the voyages, but the primary mode was trade and tribute, not colonization. The returns were extraordinary. The Yongle Emperor's court received ambassadors from dozens of countries. It received ostriches, zebras, and, most famously, giraffes. The giraffe deserves a moment. When Zheng He's fleet returned from Africa with 2 giraffes in 1414, they caused a sensation at the Ming court. The giraffe bore a resemblance to the qilin, a mythical creature in Chinese legend associated with the arrival of a great and virtuous ruler. Court officials immediately declared that the appearance of the qilin confirmed the Yongle Emperor's heavenly mandate. The emperor himself, to his credit, dismissed this interpretation, perhaps because he knew too well how stolen his mandate actually was. But the political symbolism was unmistakable. The world's most exotic creatures had come to pay tribute to China's emperor. These voyages established Chinese diplomatic relationships across the entire Indian Ocean world. Chinese merchants followed in the fleet's wake. Chinese communities established themselves in ports from Malacca to Mombasa. The Ming Dynasty, for roughly 3 decades, was the undisputed dominant power from the South China Sea to the Persian Gulf. And then the Yongle Emperor died in 1424. What followed was not a military defeat or an economic collapse. It was a bureaucratic faction fight, the kind of internal political struggle that leaves no dramatic battlefield, produces no famous last stands, and is therefore almost invisible in popular history. But it destroyed China's naval capacity as completely as any military disaster could have. The Ming court was divided between 2 groups with fundamentally incompatible visions. On one side, the eunuch faction, associated with the voyages, with maritime trade, with outward engagement. Zheng He was a eunuch. The voyages had been organized, staffed, and managed largely by eunuch officials. For them, China's future lay in projecting power across the seas, in the commercial and diplomatic relationships that the voyages had built. On the other side, the Confucian scholar officials, the mandarins who had passed the civil service examinations and believed they represented the legitimate moral order of the state. For them, the voyages were a grotesque waste. Agriculture was the foundation of civilization. Trade was morally suspect, associated with merchants who cared only for profit. The sea was chaos and danger. And worst of all, the voyages had been organized by eunuchs, men who, in Confucian thinking, were fundamentally improper, neither truly male nor female, serving in roles that should belong to properly educated gentlemen. Every treasure ship that returned was, in the Confucian worldview, a monument to everything wrong with the current direction of the empire. The Confucian officials won. Not immediately, not in a single dramatic confrontation, but gradually, emperor by emperor, as each new ruler of the Ming Dynasty found the Confucian faction more useful than the eunuch faction. The 7th and final voyage departed in 1430. Zheng He himself commanded it, dying at sea in 1433 near the coast of India at approximately 62 years old. After his death, no further voyages were authorized. Funding for the Navy was cut. The great shipyards at Nanjing, which had built the treasure fleet, were allowed to deteriorate. Then came the deliberate erasure. A Confucian official named Liu Daxia, by some accounts one of the most principled men of his era, a man genuinely committed to his vision of good government, located the records of Zheng He's voyages in the imperial archives. The navigational charts, the logs of 7 expeditions, the accumulated geographic and diplomatic knowledge of 3 decades of exploration. He burned them, or he hid them so effectively that they have never been found. His reasoning, as he explained it to colleagues, was explicit and coherent within his worldview. The voyages had been a waste of resources that impoverished the state and corrupted its values. Preserving the records would only tempt future emperors to repeat the mistake. The knowledge had to be destroyed to protect China from itself.
Within decades of Liu Daxia's decision, Chinese law made it a capital offense to build a ship with more than 2 masts. The maritime knowledge accumulated over 7 voyages, the wind patterns of the Indian Ocean, the locations of harbors from Malacca to Mombasa, the diplomatic relationships with dozens of foreign rulers, was gone. Not lost through neglect or disaster, deliberately, systematically, purposefully destroyed by men who believed they were doing the right thing. Here is the counterfactual that is impossible to stop thinking about. When Zheng He reached the east coast of Africa in the 1420s, he was operating ships 5 times larger than anything European navies would build for another century. He had navigational tools, experienced crews, and maritime infrastructure that no European explorer could match. The Portuguese, who would become the first Europeans to round Africa's southern tip in 1488, were building on knowledge accumulated over decades of cautious coastal exploration. Zheng He had been sailing open ocean to Africa 60 years before Bartolomeo Diaz. If the voyages had continued, if Liu Daxia had lost his factional struggle instead of winning it, Chinese ships would have rounded the Cape of Good Hope by the 1450s at the latest. They would have entered the Atlantic. They would have reached the Americas before Columbus, not by a few years, by decades, possibly by half a century. What that world would have looked like is genuinely unknowable. But we do know what the world that actually happened looked like. Portuguese and Spanish ships followed the routes that Zheng He's fleet had pioneered, arriving in Asia in the 1490s and early 1500s. They found Chinese trading communities already established in every major port. They found people who remembered the great treasure ships. And they proceeded to build colonial empires across a world that China had explored and then abandoned. The decision made by a faction of Confucian bureaucrats in a palace in Beijing in the 1420s and 1430s may be the single most consequential act of deliberate self-limitation in human history. They chose to make China smaller. And the world that exists today, including the world those bureaucrats were trying to protect, was shaped permanently by that choice. The story of Zheng He is not really a story about exploration or navigation or even about China specifically. It's a story about what happens when internal politics overrides strategic interest. When the people who control access to power decide that the risks of engagement with the outside world outweigh the costs of withdrawal. Liu Daxia was not a villain. He was a man with a coherent vision of what China should be, who won a political argument and implemented his vision as thoroughly as his position allowed. The fact that his victory had consequences he could not have imagined, that it left the Indian Ocean open for European powers who would spend the next 4 centuries building empires that reshaped the world, is not something he could have predicted or prevented from within his own framework of understanding. This dynamic appears in every civilization that has ever faced the tension between engagement and isolation. The specific faction names change, The ideological justifications change, but the basic structure, an internal political battle whose winner determines whether a society turns outward or inward, is as old as politics itself. Zheng He died at sea in 1433, somewhere in the Indian Ocean, on his way back from his seventh and final voyage. He is buried, if the tomb in Nanjing that bears his name is genuine, in the city where the greatest fleet in history was built, and where the knowledge of how to build it was eventually lost. He built something extraordinary. A system that could reach the world decided, for its own reasons, that the world wasn't worth reaching. Some things are like that. Here is what I want you to think about. If China had continued the voyages, if the Confucian faction had lost instead of won, what happens to the Americas? What happens to Africa? What does the modern world look like if it's China, not Europe, that arrives first? There is no right answer, but the question is worth sitting with. Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know what you think. And if this kind of history is what you're here for, subscribe. There's more coming.